Well, hello. I want to do a presentation. This is a program I gave recently, uh, kind of an overview on the Seminole War. And since I did the program in Tallahassee, I kind of added some things in Tallahassee and places to visit just to let people know. And so, like a lot of my programs nowadays, I also want to put them on the YouTube channel so people get to see them and kind of preserve them because I want to share my programs. This is about Tallahassee and the Florida Seminole Wars, 1816 to 1817. I'm sorry, 1816 to 1858. And I'm mainly doing this because it's Tallahassee's 200th anniversary and kind of want to connect that to the Seminole Wars going on in Florida. Of course, we can kind of date it during the War of 1812. There were some skirmishes between the United States and the Seminoles. Uh, Colonel Daniel Noonan from Georgia burned Payne's uh, town and Payne's Prairie, and there's conflict in the Indians. Negotiations followed, but neither trusted the other side. So you have Spanish Florida and Georgia to the north as the United States, and they don't trust each other. And if there I go. Okay. Well, when the British left at the close of the War of 1812, they handed over a well-armed fortification on the Apalachicola River to the blacks and Indians who had been trained as Royal Marines, known as Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort in the Apalachicola Forest. And Jackson ordered it destroyed. American gunboats came up the Apalachicola River, fired on the fort, and a hot shot hit the powder magazine, blowing the whole thing up in a tremendous explosion that could be heard 200 miles away in Pensacola on the 27th of July, 1816, and killing about 300 people inside the fort. And I've done other videos on this that you can look up. So, uh, kind of a big shot that was fired by Jackson's forces, and things settled down for a little bit, but there was still raids and attacks between the Native Americans, the Miccosukees, and the Georgians. Just for simplicity's sake, in the early 18th century, all the Indians were called Seminoles in Florida. So the First Seminole War in 1817, President James Monroe authorized Andrew Jackson to form an expeditionary force to deal with the raids into Georgia and Alabama and capture runaway slaves who have escaped into Florida. Uh, John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, well, try not to go into Florida unless you really have to. And of course, Jackson decided that he had to. The United States established Fort Scott on the confluence of the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint Rivers, what's now Lake Seminole, to keep the Seminoles in check. And also at the time where he's watching a stragglers coming up from Prospect Bluff that before the Americans blew up. The soldiers raided and destroyed and burned down the nearby Foultown on the Georgia side on Flint River. So the natives took retaliation on November 30th, 1817. A supply boat going to Fort Scott was attacked on the Apalachicola River in retaliation to Foultown's destruction. This gave Andrew Jackson the excuse to go into Florida and pursue the Seminoles since they had attacked a military transport. And the site of this is on what's today Chattahoochee Landing in this town of Chattahoochee on the Apalachicola River. There's several information kiosks and things that you can visit. Oh, before I forget, the Prospect Bluff on the uh, Apalachicola River, the fort's currently closed. We don't know when it will open. Hopefully it'll open soon, but of course I said that a year ago and it's still not open. So we're waiting. Hopefully that'll happen soon. So General Andrew Jackson, he commands an army from Fort Scott of about 3,000 soldiers, Tennessee militia, native allies who came down to Fort Scott, Creek warriors commanded by General William McIntosh, were with Jackson's army, and that's William McIntosh on the left. So Jackson enters Spanish Florida and establishes Fort Gadsden on the ruins of the former fort on Prospect Bluff. This becomes an American outpost, kind of like the 19th century Guantanamo. It remains an American fortification from 1818 until Florida is ceded over to the United States 3 years later in 1821. Then Jackson goes down to the remote Spanish outpost of Fort St. Mark's, and you can visit that fort today, also known as Fort San Marcos. Jackson walks in and forces it to surrender. The United States now has permanent footholds, taking over Spanish fortifications in Florida, even though they told him that if he got to that point to write Congress at first, Jackson didn't wait. He just took field authority. Jackson's army burned a large village at Miccosukee, destroyed crops, captured escaped slaves. It believes that they stopped at what's now Lake Ella in downtown Tallahassee. There's a Seminole village in the area that had been abandoned. And in fact, that's just a block away from where I'm making this video. The two captured British merchants, Alexander Arbuthnot and Robert Ambrister, were tried before a military tribunal and executed for aiding the Indians at Fort St. Mark's. Red Stick Creek leader Josiah Francis was also captured and executed. Of course, British subjects executed by a military court without a declaration of war would create a lot of controversy and debate in Congress for the next few years. Jackson's adjutant, Robert Butler, was somebody that he had raised, was the adjutant general of Jackson's forces, and he became the first surveyor general of Florida. And he had his plantation around what is known as Lake Jackson today. And this is his grave, buried inside the woods off Crowder Road near Lake Jackson Mounds. There, Robert Butler has a Mason emblem on the front there. Adams-Onis Treaty was signed in February 22nd, 1819. No money was exchanged. It's basically canceling all the debts. And Florida officially became a U.S. territory in July of 1821. Andrew Jackson served as the first territorial governor of Florida. Florida Indians were referred to as Seminoles, from Spanish colloquial term from the Caribbean, Cimarron, meaning wild. Soon all Native Americans of Florida were known as Seminoles, even though they were Miccosukes, like Neamathla here. He was chief of the Miccosukes. And so Neamathla was a very wise and smart negotiator. He had fought the United States, and they negotiated the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. He led his people on the fine line between resistance and accommodation, trying to get what he could from the growing United States power coming from the north. With Florida as a new U.S. territory, settlers moving in soon came in conflict with the natives over land, cattle, runaway slaves, both that and raiding each other to get those. At the time, there was a drought in Florida. There was a record winter and then a drought. So food wasn't growing that they were trying to plant. Everyone was starving. William Pope Duval succeeds Andrew Jackson as governor in 1822. Folklore is that Neamathla gave Duval the land where he had his mansion built today near the Capitol in Tallahassee. The area is known as Cascade Park. And there's a monument there in the middle, the prime meridian where all the surveys in Florida come from. So kind of Seminole War history. These are different places you can visit in Tallahassee. So increased pressure from the new settlers forced the Seminoles to sign the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, granting 5 million acres for the natives in Central Florida in 1823. And unfortunately, this was not a very good treaty because the Seminole Reservation was very vaguely defined. They only really surveyed the northern boundary and then had to change it again to get arable land for the Seminoles to grow their crops and supporting the people living there. All the people in Florida were suffering from a drought, so the U.S. government promised annuity and food and supply, but the government sadly underestimated the native population of those needing to be fed. Also, the natives had to travel a long ways outside the reservation to get their annuities, like over to Palatka on the East Coast, just south of St. Augustine, or Tampa Bay, which both of those places were clearly not in the reservation. One of the people who negotiated the treaty was James Gadsden. He was the Indian agent in Florida for a short time. The Florida Legislative Council began the idea to remove the Seminoles. And so Colonel Gadsden also negotiated the Treaty of Payne's Landing to remove all the natives from Florida in 1832. James Gadsden's famous for the Gadsden Purchase that ceded half of New Mexico and Arizona from Mexico to the United States in 1853. Colonel Gadsden, he had a plantation in an area east of Tallahassee, now known as Wakena. In fact, James Gadsden has a brother who's buried out there. From all I could tell, his brother kind of lived most of all his life out in that plantation area. But the treaty didn't work out, and conflict between Seminoles and settlers escalated. The Treaty of Payne's Landing also gave rise to a division in the Seminoles, and with the rise of Osceola and younger warriors pledging resistance and that they're not leaving Florida. After the treaty, the United States sent a delegation of 6 Seminole chiefs inspectors to Arkansas Territory to check the proposed land. They weren't too crazy about it. Nothing like Florida. The governor of Florida, appointed by Andrew Jackson at the beginning of the Second Seminole War, was Richard Keith Call, former captain of Jackson. Many of the state legislature and people, the founding U.S. Legislators in Florida, many of them came with Jackson into Florida originally during the First Seminole War. Richard Keith Call, he became territorial governor. You can visit his former mansion, the Grove, in Tallahassee. It's off Monroe Street, right north of Brevard, and there's kind of a intersection there that where Thomasville Road starts. But March 9th, the Grove is having Grove Day. It's kind of the opening day. A lot of history in Tallahassee happened right there. So pretty cool place to visit. Well, Seminole raids continued in North Florida as the armies tried to build new forts and garrisons. As the Second Seminole War starts in December 1835, at first there was only about 500 soldiers in Florida spread between St. Augustine, Tampa Bay, and Pensacola, few in St. Augustine. But I think there was probably less than 1,000 U.S. Army soldiers in the whole southeastern United States at the time, if that many, mainly the 4th Infantry Regiment. On December 28th, 1835, Major Dade, with 100 soldiers coming up from Tampa Bay to Fort King in Ocala. Before they arrived at Fort King, about 40 miles south, they were ambushed by Seminole and Miccosukee warriors, and all but 3 soldiers escaped, and a black interpreter named Louis Pacheco, who was prisoner of the Seminoles for about a year and 15 months, actually. On the same day as that battle, Osceola assassinated the Indian agent Wiley Thompson at Fort King. And the United States kind of got the picture that the Seminoles are going to resist removal, and the Second Seminole War had begun. They called the Dade Massacre, we call it the Dade Battle today. It shocked the country. Panic ensued. It was in every paper in the United States, and Congress declared war and authorized the Army to capture, remove, or exterminate any Indians within Florida with their black allies. So, as part of the doctrine at the time, the United States had a very small regular force and would rely on state militia. But every state had a arsenal where the militia would keep arms and ammunition. And so in Chattahoochee, Florida, you have the Apalachicola Arsenal, which is on the grounds of the State Museum. You'll have to go through the guard gate and get directions to it. But this is the reconstructed Apalachicola Arsenal. It's beautiful inside. I think I've had some previous videos on that. It's actually double walls, so if the inside had blown up, the wall would blow into a secondary wall in the arsenal. That never happened, but there's a few buildings on the grounds that were made during the Seminole War, but this is the only one open to the public. And throughout the war, sporadic attacks continued along the settlements and counties surrounding Tallahassee. The Cherris Plantation was attacked near Lake Lafayette. For example, there's raids around Monticello and Wassissa, Gadsden County. There was a settler woman killed around Tulogia Creek, and I think that's around Jackson or Liberty County, or maybe anyway, I did a video on that too a while back. So the Second War was finally declared over in 1842. This was the second phase of the war. The Seminoles themselves consider not three Seminole Wars, but one long continuous war. In December 1855, the Third Seminole War began as the last attempt by the U.S. Army and state government in Florida to remove the native people from Florida. And one of the last battles of the war was Captain John Parkhill from Tallahassee with his company from Tallahassee and Gadsden County was killed in Big Cypress on November 28th, 1858. In extreme southwest Florida, the area is believed to be around what's now Fakahatchee Strand Preserve. And in front of the Capitol in Tallahassee is a monument to Captain Parkhill, one of two monuments of the Third Seminole War in Florida. This is not a grave because Captain Parkhill is not buried there. He was buried on the shore of Deep Lake in the Big Cypress National Preserve, but his family was very influential in Florida. So, Third Seminole War ended in 1858. Florida became open for settlement. Former military roads and outposts really opened up the frontier. In total, 42 years of warfare, over roughly 3,000 lives are lost of state and federal troops, 4,200 natives sent to Oklahoma. Just a couple remained in Florida, anywhere estimated from 200 to 500. No real count was possible at the time. And it cost between 20 and $30 million was expended to attempt to remove the Seminoles. People ask me if anybody won the Seminole Wars, and I said nobody won. They asked me who won. I said it was a lost cause for everyone. It was pretty much came out a draw because the Seminoles were not totally removed from Florida, and the United States did not get its objective that way, even though it was a hefty price. And Seminole Miccosukee tribes in Florida are descended from the couple hundred natives who remained in Florida when the wars ended. So that's kind of a quick overview of Florida's three Seminole Wars. Just a quick program. Hope you enjoyed it. And we'll hope to join you again for the next